Hello and welcome to my fireside chat series here. In this series, I'm going to be discussing the ethical violations in forensic psychology. And oh my goodness, there's a lot of them. And this will also serve later on as a foundation to some of the seminars I'll do about cross-examining mental health testimony, because this is one of the domains, one of the lines of questioning that all forensic psychologists are vulnerable on, and they have to testify about their custody evaluations. So these are lines of questions that can really wrap them up in knots. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present the ethical violations across a series of 4 video segments. This first one, I'm going to discuss the sort of the broad scale ethical violations, but then I'll address some of the secondary ethics violations, um, and just sort of the stray and random ones that they're also in violation of. But then we'll focus more specifically on 3 standards. Standard 2.01, boundaries of competence. None of them are competent in the diagnostic assessment of delusional thought disorders. None of them are competent in attachment pathology, and this is an attachment pathology. And none of them are competent in family systems therapy either. So, or dialectic behavior, or a number of things are not competent in complex trauma and child abuse. But the big ones are the diagnostic assessment of delusional thought and attachment pathology. Since this is a shared persecutory delusion and an attachment pathology, you'd think they'd be competent in that, but they're not. And that leads to a violation of standard 2.01, boundaries of competence, but that in turn leads to a violation of standard 2.04, bases for scientific and professional judgments. Because they don't know the knowledge, they didn't apply the knowledge. So they have 2 violations in the competence standards. All the 2 numbers are competence standards in the APA ethics code. And then because they don't know the knowledge and didn't apply the knowledge, they are then in violation of standard 9.01, bases for assessment. And that's the core one that undermines the credibility of their recommendations and reports. That 9.01 says that their opinions and in the recommendations, reports, diagnostic and evaluative statements are not based on information and techniques sufficient to substantiate their findings. Violations to the competence standards. They didn't apply knowledge, they didn't know knowledge. But there's a number of other ethical violations as well. Maintaining competence, avoiding harm, other ones as well. So in this opening segment, I'm going to just do a broad overview of all the ethical violations. And then in the next 3, I'll focus on standard 2.01, boundaries of competence, then on standard 2.04, bases for scientific and professional judgments, and then on 9.01, the bases for assessment. So let's start in with the ethical violations in forensic psychology. So this is just the list of all of them. And it starts with a basic principle of justice that we'll talk about in a second. Principle D, justice, that guarantees equal access and equal quality of services. So they're in violation of that. Then the 2 ethical violations or 2 ethical standards that are governing my work in the family courts are standard 1.04, informal notification of ethical violations, and standard 1.05, reporting ethical violations. Now, the ethics code is mandatory. And so those 2 standards, 1.04 and 1.05, are required of me. They're requiring me to take specific actions. And so I'm doing that. And I'm doing that in this segment. I'm following the mandates of the APA ethics code when I encounter ethical violations. It's the APA and the other psychologists who are simply disregarding the ethical standards, and licensing boards as well. So we have those 2, 1.04 and 1.05, that are governing me and what I do. Then, as I mentioned, standard 2.01, boundaries of competence, None of the forensic psychologists are competent in the assessment of delusional thought disorders or in attachment pathology. And since this is a shared persecutory delusion and a false attachment pathology, they are practicing substantially beyond the boundaries of their competence. And the problematic thing is that they don't care. They it's just irrelevant to them whether or not they are actually competent or know what they're doing. And the whole field of forensic psychology is an experiment in service delivery. They just kind of made it up in the 1980s, a new field, and kind of gave them carte blanche to experiment on you. And it's been a massively failed and massively tragic experiment in the family courts, and it needs to end. And then they're in violation of 2.03, maintaining competence, because they're required to do stuff to stay current on competence. And they're not even competent to begin with, more or less maintaining competence. So there's two steps down below competent level. And then standard 2.04. Now, all the twos are competence standards, which is bases for scientific and professional judgments. And they're required to base their opinions on the established scientific and professional knowledge of the discipline. And as Bowlby, Mnuchin, Beck, family systems, complex trauma, Vanderkolk, that's the established knowledge. And they're required to apply the established knowledge before they start making things up. So before they make up parental alienation or resist refuse dynamic, they're required to actually apply the knowledge. And if they do that, if we apply the actual knowledge of psychology, then everything's fixed. We diagnose the pathology and everything's solved. There's no need for these made up kind of pathologies once we apply knowledge. They're just not doing that. They just disregard the APA ethics code. They disregard knowledge. It's just phenomenal. But another one that's relevant here, a couple in the 3 series, which is human relations. The first one is avoiding harm. We're not allowed to harm people. And I'll talk about that in a second. Not anybody. Doctors do no harm. And so the only harm we cause is unavoidable harm. And certainly making custody decisions, deciding who deserves to have a child is not unavoidable harm. The way we avoid harm is by treatment, taking a treatment approach rather than a custody approach. We fix things, and that way we don't have to wind up hurting anybody. But I'll talk about that. The other one is standard 3.09 on cooperation with professionals. Now, they should be consulting. And if you ask the mental health person to consult with Dr. Childress, they should probably consult with Dr. Childress under 3.09, cooperation with other professionals, simply because you asked them to. And so that's an ethical requirement to kind of work together with other professionals, but they don't, because the moment they do, they admit they're not competent in doing things, and then they're in violation of all the other ethical standards. And then the final one is the 9.01, the bases for assessment. And that's where everything comes down to. And so on cross-examination, it would typically recommend running through like some of the 2.01 line of questions, 2.04 line of questions, and diagnostic kind of questions. And then when you got a nice substantial domain of ethically questionable activity, then you land up on 9.01, that their opinions as contained in their reports are not based on information and techniques sufficient to substantiate their findings, so we can basically throw them out or throw out their recommendations. So that's the broad overview of the ethical violations over here. Now let me run through each one of these a little bit more in detail. So we see 1.04, informal resolution of ethical violations. The APA ethics code for psychologists is mandatory. It is required. It's not optional. Ethical practice for psychologists is not optional. It is required. So this standard, 1.04, is required of me. So when psychologists believe there may have been an ethical violation by another psychologist, notice a very low bar. It just may be an ethical violation. They attempt to resolve the issue by bringing it to the attention of that individual. So we don't run straight to a licensing board and start making formal complaints. If we're concerned about another psychologist and their ethical practice, we are required to reach out to them informally and let them know and see if we can help support them, and they can maybe self-correct and take a look at the situation. But we are required to do something. Psychologists must act. This is a standard that gives us, we must take an affirmative action to do something when we encounter possible ethical violations, that there may be ethical violations, that we're supposed to do something. Not only is doing something in response to ethical violations by other psychologists important enough to get an ethics standard in the APA ethics code, it gets two standards, not one standard in two parts, two separate standards. If this doesn't solve the situation, then there's standard 1.05. And this is the one that's governing my actions, mostly in the family courts at this point. I will have a few letters I'll be putting out that have to do with the informal notification. But for the most part, the petition to the APA, the presentation to the AFCC, these videos, my blogs, a number of steps I've taken have been pursuant to my mandatory obligations under 1.05. So this says, if an apparent ethical violation, again, apparent ethical violation, has substantially harmed or is likely to substantially harm. So that's the first clause. And yes, the ethical violations in the family courts by the forensic psychologist have substantially harmed and are likely to continue to substantially harm children and parents because of incompetent practice. Substantially harm a person or organization, and it is not appropriate for informal resolution under standard 1.04. Well, I can't contact every single forensic psychologist for informal notification, so actually know the extent and breadth of the ethical violations are so large that it's not appropriate for resolution under 1.04. And in addition, though, it is also not resolved properly in that fashion. I told the APA, petition to the APA, I told them. I told the AFCC, I went to their national convention and told them. And it was not properly resolved in that fashion. So now both of those two clauses are now met, either one of which would indicate I move to the next phase. And so what do I do when those two clauses are met? That it's not appropriate and it wasn't resolved properly in that fashion. And attend to this. I notified the American Psychological Association, hand delivered a petition signed by 20,000 parents notifying them of the rampant and unchecked ethical violations in forensic psychology. So the APA is actually kind of in violation of their own ethics standard 1.05. So whoever they gave those petition to in the APA, any psychologist who read the petition to the APA is in violation of 1.05. So track who they gave it to, and those are the people who are disabling the mental health system response. So, so what do I have to do? That psychologists take further action appropriate to the situation. Well, what is that? They give some suggestions. Might include referral to state or national committees on professional ethics, to state licensing boards or appropriate institutional authorities. So I'm recommending to all of you parents, under all circumstances that you think there's been ethical violations by your forensic psychologist, to notify your state licensing board. That's the appropriate avenue for the redress of your grievance under standard 1.05. Now, the licensing boards aren't going to do anything because they're covering up for the forensic psychologists, and not the entire licensing board. The forensic psychologists on the licensing board are covering up for the forensic psychologists. And so we just need to clean the entire field of professional psychology of these experimental new forensic psychologists who are absolutely awful. Clinical psychologists need to be treating all pathology, ADHD, autism, everything, and we need to move to the highest standard of professional practice. But the clinical psychology won't work in the family courts because it's too dangerous. And so we have a cascading series of systems issues. But these are the two ethical standards that are governing all my practice. So people I think I'm out here like leading a movement or doing, no, I've got ethical obligations and I have duty to protect obligations. As soon as we start protecting these children, I can go back to being normal. But right now, I'm just in super elevated mode because we have active child abuse and active spousal abuse for 10 years, and no psychologists are doing anything about it for 10 years. And so that's a problem. Um, and so those are the my ethical standards. Now, here's something interesting: is that forensic psychology is in violation of an actual principle of professional psychology, that all persons should have access to and benefit from the contributions of psychology and equal quality in the procedures. Notice I mentioned boundaries of competence down there. That that the forensic custody evaluations that cost $20,000 to $40,000 do not provide equal access to everybody. Unless you're wealthy, you can't afford a forensic. Then what do you get in place? Nothing. They provide nothing other than their forensic psychology child evaluations because they say that that's required, but they only provide it to a small percentage of people. That it's just they're in violation of principle D, justice on equal access and benefit, but also equal quality. There's no inter-rater reliability to these forensic custody evaluators, meaning two psychologists, forensic psychologists, can come up with entirely different conclusions and recommendations based on exactly the same data. There's no inter-rater reliability in these things. So they're in violation of both clauses of justice. But again, they don't care. And so it's like amazingly bad professional practice in the family courts. So another little side one, in addition to the main ethical violations, is maintaining competence. Psychologists are required to undertake ongoing efforts to develop and maintain their competence. Notice it doesn't say psychologists, that Dr. Childress is required to educate them about their competence. No, it's their ethical obligation to maintain, take ongoing effort to maintain their competence. That's my favorite saying: don't try to teach a pig to sing. It just frustrates you and annoys the pig. I'm not going to try to teach these lazy, ignorant, incompetent, unethical malpractice forensic psychologists to kind of elevate their game. It is their responsibility, not mine. Under Standard 2.03, under Standard 2.01, under Standard 2.04. Avoiding harm. So notice there's two parts to avoiding harm here. And the psychologists take reasonable steps to avoid harming their clients, patients, students, and people that they work with where harm is foreseeable and unavoidable. Separating a parent from a child is going to cause harm to the child. It's going to cause harm to the parent. It's foreseeable and it's unnecessary. If we get a proper treatment plan, a diagnosis and treatment plan, we fix things. We don't have to separate children from their parents. And so when they do separate them, they recommend that the child go with one parent. Do they recommend grief counseling for the other parent, or do they do anything about managing the tremendous grief and loss of the targeted parent having lost their child? No. It's like, oh my God, psychologists do no harm. Doctors do no harm. And to separate a child from a parent for anything other than child abuse will damage that child's attachment bond to that parent, thereby harming the child and harming that parent. And so we don't separate children from parents for any reason other than child abuse. A child protection response is the only reason we do it. And if we do that, we need a diagnosis of child abuse to justify the separation. Now, notice on this too, avoiding harm B, psychologists do not participate in, facilitate, assist, or otherwise engage in torture as defined by any act of. So we are prohibited from engaging in any way with the enhanced interrogation of terrorists. So we're not even allowed to harm terrorists if they have knowledge that's going to, save 1,000 lives. We're not allowed to do enhanced or participate, facilitate, or do anything in terms of, because that's going to harm that terrorist person. And yet we're allowed to harm you and take your kids away. It is for no reason, for no justifiable reason. We just wind up taking kids away. That that's a violation of avoiding harm. We're causing harm to these parents and to their children. Cooperation with other professionals. When indicated and professionally appropriate, psychologists cooperate with other professionals in order to serve their clients' patients effectively and appropriately. So I would say that pretty much covers. If you ask, simply ask your mental health person to consult with Dr. Childress. You pay them for their time. They don't have to agree with me. They don't have to do it, but they're cooperating with another professional in order to serve their clients' patients effectively and appropriately, because they're not competent in a number of these pathologies than I am. So that, I would say, covers consultation. And again, these are mandatory requirements. So now I'll get into boundaries of competence over in the next session. The Just broadly stated, though, there should not be one ethical violation within forensic psychology, but you can look at that. Look at that list of ethical violations there. And they are doing nothing about it. The APA is doing nothing about it. The licensing boards are doing nothing about it. The AFCC is doing nothing about it. I can tell them under 1.05, 1.04. I can tell them. I've been telling them. They do nothing. And that's the problem over here in the family courts, is the standards of practice are abysmal. Where are the licensing boards? Why is Dr. Childress coming up with this set of ethical violations? That's a failure of the licensing boards. Flat out, flat out. And so get your legislatures over and say, licensing boards, where are you when Dr. Childress can raise this number of ethical violations? And they are nowhere to be seen. So with that, let's move over to standard 2.01.